In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, a famous novelist, Lawrence Pennington, is found strangled in his study, a crimson scarf tight around his neck. Miss Jane Marple, the sharp-eyed spinster with a knack for unraveling secrets, steps into a web of envy and betrayal. Was it the ambitious editor, the obsessive fan, the loyal assistant, or the envious rival who silenced him? As clues, sandalwood scent, a burned manuscript, a scuffed windowsill. Emerge, Miss Marple weaves a tapestry of truth, revealing a killer driven by pride in a chilling tale of murder in just 30 seconds. Chapter 1. The Silent Study. The morning mist draped St. Mary Mead in a gauzy veil, softening the edges of its thatched cottages and winding lanes. Miss Jane Marple sat by her parlor window, her delicate hands folded over a cup of Darjeeling, its steam curling like a question mark. The village was stirring, but a peculiar hush hung over it, broken only by the distant chime of the church clock striking 9. It was Mrs. Bantry, bustling in with her usual flurry of scarves and gossip, who brought the news that set Miss Marple's keen mind alight. "Jane, have you heard?" Mrs. Bantry's eyes were wide, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "Lawrence Pennington, that famous novelist up at Willow Cottage, found dead this morning. Strangled, they say, right in his study. Quite dreadful." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly, her serene expression unchanged, save for a faint sharpening in her pale blue eyes. "Strangled, Dolly? How very shocking. Who found him, I wonder?" The milkman, of all people, saw the study light on at an odd hour and peeked in. There was poor Pennington slumped at his desk. The police are there now, poking about. Oh, Jane, it's like something out of one of his own novels. Miss Marple set her teacup down, her mind already sifting through the implications. Lawrence Pennington was no ordinary resident of St. Mary Mead. His detective novels, filled with clever twists and sinister motives, had made him a literary darling, though his reclusive nature kept him apart from village life. She recalled seeing him once at the post office, a tall man with a distracted air, his scarf perpetually askew. Strangulation suggested intimacy, passion, or desperation, a crime not of impulse, but of intent. Her fingers itched for her knitting, a habit that steadied her thoughts. "I think, Dolly," she said mildly, "I shall take a walk to Willow Cottage. A condolence call is only proper, don't you think? Poor Mr. Pennington's housekeeper must be quite shaken." Mrs. Bantry, sensing the glint of purpose behind Miss Marple's placid tone, nodded eagerly. "You'll get to the bottom of it, Jane. You always do. Those little observations of yours, why, they're sharper than Inspector Slack's." Miss Marple permitted herself a small smile, neither confirming nor denying. She rose, smoothing her tweed skirt, and fetched her sturdy coat and hat. The air was crisp as she stepped onto the lane, her sensible shoes clicking softly against the damp cobblestones. Willow Cottage lay at the edge of the village, its rose-covered walls charming but isolated, a fitting retreat for a man who lived in his imagination. As she approached, she noted the police car parked askew, its presence jarring against the cottage's quiet beauty. Constable Reed, a young man with an earnest face, stood at the gate, his notebook clutched tightly. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, touching his cap. "Come to pay respects, have you? It's a bad business, this." "Very bad indeed, Constable," she replied, her voice gentle but her eyes scanning the scene. "Might I see the study? I shan't disturb anything, of course." Reed hesitated, then nodded, knowing Miss Marple's reputation for solving what the police often missed. He led her through the cottage's narrow hall, past a ticking grandfather clock and a vase of wilting dahlias, to the study door. The room was a writer's sanctuary, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a typewriter perched on a heavy mahogany desk, and papers scattered like fallen leaves. The air held a faint tang of ink and tobacco. Pennington's body had been taken away, but the room felt heavy with his absence. Miss Marple's gaze settled on a crimson silk scarf, coiled like a serpent on the polished floor. It was out of place amid the room's masculine clutter, its vibrant hue catching the light from the open window. She stepped closer, noting the window's latch was undone, a faint scuff mark marring the sill. On the desk, an ashtray held a half-burned cigarette, its ash crumbling. A glass of whiskey, barely touched, stood beside a stack of typed pages. She did not touch anything, but her eyes catalogued every detail, filing them away like stitches in a pattern. "Found just as you see it, miss," Reed said, shifting uncomfortably. "The scarf's what did it, they reckon. Wrapped tight round his neck. Happened last night sometime after 8. "And visitors?" Miss Marple asked, her tone as casual as if inquiring about the weather. "Mr. Pennington was not one for company, I understand." Reed flipped open his notebook. 4, by the housekeeper's account. Miss Clara Henshaw, his editor, came about 7. Mr. Felix Drayton, a fan, was here before that. Miss Emily Price, his assistant, was in and out all evening, and Mr. Roland Vane, another writer, called late, around 10:30. We're questioning them all, but it's a muddle so far. Miss Marple nodded, her mind already weaving threads. An editor, a fan, an assistant, a rival, each a distinct knot in the tapestry of Pennington's life. Clara Henshaw, she recalled, was a formidable woman, her ambition as sharp as her red lipstick. Felix Drayton, a name mentioned in village chatter, was an intense young man who wrote fervent letters to his idol. Emily Price, quiet and mousy, had been seen carrying manuscripts to the post, and Roland Vane, whose novels competed with Pennington's, had a reputation for a temper as vivid as his prose. Motives, Miss Marple knew, were like village scandals, plentiful but needing careful sorting. "Thank you, Constable," she said, her smile disarming. "I'll not keep you. I shall call on the housekeeper later, perhaps. Grief wants company, after all." As she left the cottage, the mist was lifting, revealing the village in sharp relief. Miss Marple walked slowly, her mind turning over the scarf, the scuff, the cigarette. Human nature, she reflected, was much the same whether in St. Mary Mead or a novelist's study. Someone had hated or feared Lawrence Pennington enough to end his story, and she, with her quiet ways and sharp eyes, would find the hand that held the pen, or the scarf. Chapter 2. The Scene of the Crime. The sun had barely pierced the morning mist when Miss Jane Marple stepped once more onto the gravel path leading to Willow Cottage. The village of St. Mary Mead, usually so serene, thrummed with a subdued excitement, as if the very hedgerows whispered of the tragedy within. Constable Reed, his youthful face etched with the gravity of his task, met her at the gate, his cap slightly askew from a morning of bustling activity. "Back again, Miss Marple?" he said, his tone a mix of respect and mild bewilderment. "Inspector Slack's inside, but he's in a mood. Mind your step." Miss Marple's lips curved into a gentle smile, her pale blue eyes twinkling with a knowing calm. "Thank you, Constable. I shan't trouble the inspector unduly. I only wish to offer my sympathies and see if I might be of any small assistance." Her voice was soft, almost apologetic, But Reed knew better than to underestimate the elderly spinster, whose unassuming air masked a mind sharper than a freshly honed penknife. He led her through the cottage's low-beamed hallway, where the air smelled faintly of beeswax and old books. The grandfather clock ticked solemnly, its pendulum swinging like a metronome to the village's quiet rhythm. A vase of dahlias, their petals curling inward, as if shrinking from the morning's grim news, stood on a sideboard. Miss Marple noted the faint dust on the vase's rim. Mrs. Gibbs, the housekeeper, must have been too shaken to attend to her usual duties. They passed into the study, and the scene that greeted Miss Marple was one of ordered chaos, a tableau frozen in the aftermath of violence. The study was a sanctuary of words, its walls lined with oak shelves, groaning under the weight of leather-bound volumes and dog-eared paperbacks. A sturdy mahogany desk dominated the room, its surface cluttered with a typewriter, a scatter of pens, and a stack of typed pages, their edges curling slightly as if impatient to be read. A green-shaded lamp cast a soft glow, though the morning light streaming through the open window rendered it redundant. The window itself was a focal point, its latch undone, and Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught a faint scuff mark on the sill, a smudge of dirt, perhaps, or the trace of a shoe. She filed this away, her mind already turning over possibilities. On the floor, coiled like a discarded ribbon, lay the crimson silk scarf that had ended Lawrence Pennington's life. Its vibrant hue stood out starkly against the polished floorboards, a splash of color that seemed almost theatrical in its placement. Nearby, an ashtray held a half-burned cigarette, its ash crumbling into a fine gray dust. A glass of whiskey, its amber contents barely touched, stood sentinel beside the typewriter, a mute witness to the novelist's final moments. The room felt heavy, as if the air itself mourned the loss of its occupant. Inspector Slack, a burly man with a bristling mustache and a perpetual air of impatience, stood by the desk, barking orders to a young sergeant who was gingerly dusting for fingerprints. "Careful, man. Don't smudge the blasted thing," he snapped, then caught sight of Miss Marple. His scowl deepened, but he managed a curt nod. "Miss Marple, didn't expect to see you here. This is police business, you know?" "Of course, Inspector," she replied, her voice mild as milk. "I wouldn't dream of interfering. I only thought Mrs. Gibbs might need a kind word, and I confess my curiosity got the better of me. Such a dreadful affair for our little village." Slack grunted, clearly torn between dismissing her and acknowledging her uncanny knack for seeing what others missed. "Well, keep out of the way," he muttered, turning back to the sergeant. "And get those papers catalogued properly." Miss Marple drifted to the edge of the room, her small figure almost invisible against the towering bookshelves. She adjusted her spectacles and let her gaze wander, taking in every detail with the precision of a seamstress measuring cloth. The scarf, she noted, was not merely decorative, but finely made, its intricate weave suggesting expense and care. It was not the sort of thing one left carelessly behind, unless in haste or panic. She crouched slightly, her knees creaking, to examine it more closely without touching. A faint scent clung to it. Sandalwood, perhaps, mingled with something spicier. Not Pennington's scent, she was certain. His preference for pipe tobacco was well known in the village. Her eyes moved to the window. The scuff mark was subtle, a mere disturbance in the paint, but it spoke of movement, someone entering or exiting, perhaps. The window faced the garden, a tangled affair of roses and ivy, that offered ample cover for an intruder. She pictured the scene. Pennington at his desk, absorbed in his work, unaware of a shadow slipping through the night. Or perhaps the killer had been invited in, their presence unremarkable until the scarf tightened. The thought sent a shiver through her, though her expression remained serene. The desk drew her next. The typewriter's ribbon was fresh, its keys gleaming from frequent use. The stack of pages bore the title, The Final Twist, Pennington's latest work. According to village gossip, Miss Marple resisted the urge to leaf through them, knowing the inspector's temper, but she noted a single sheet slightly askew, as if hastily replaced. A smudge of ink on its corner suggested a hurried hand. The whiskey glass, too, intrigued her, its contents untouched save for a sip, the rim clean of fingerprints. Had Pennington poured it for himself or for a guest? And why leave it nearly full? The ashtray's cigarette was a curious detail. Pennington, she recalled, was not a cigarette smoker. His pipe was a fixture at the village fete, its aromatic smoke curling above the crowd. The cigarette's brand was unfamiliar, its tip marked with a faint trace of red. Lipstick, perhaps, or merely a quirk of the paper. Miss Marple's mind flitted to Clara Henshaw, whose crimson lipstick was as much a signature as her sharp tongue. But Clara was not the only possibility. The village was full of small secrets, and Miss Marple knew better than to leap to conclusions. Constable Reed hovered nearby, watching her with a mix of curiosity and unease. "Anything catch your eye, miss?" he ventured, his voice low to avoid the inspector's notice. "Oh, nothing of importance," she said airily, straightening up. "Just an old woman's fancy. But tell me, Constable, who was here last night? You mentioned visitors, I believe." Reed glanced at his notebook, grateful for the chance to be useful. "4, as Mrs. Gibbs tells it. Miss Clara Henshaw, the editor, arrived around 7 to discuss a manuscript. Left about 9, she says. Mr. Felix Drayton, that young chap who's always writing to Pennington, came by earlier, around 6. Said he wanted to talk about a fan letter. Miss Emily Price, the assistant, was here most of the evening, typing and such, till Pennington sent her home at 10. And Mr. Roland Vane, the other writer, called at 10:30 for a quick word about some literary event. All claim they left him alive." Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloging the names. Clara Henshaw, with her polished ambition, had been known to clash with Pennington over his work's direction. Felix Drayton's devotion bordered on fanaticism, his letters to Pennington the talk of the post office. Emily Price, quiet and efficient, lived in Pennington's shadow, her loyalty unquestioned, but her circumstances modest. And Roland Vane, whose novels vied with Pennington's for acclaim, carried a grudge as sharp as his prose. Each had a reason to be in this room, and each, Miss Marple suspected, had a story to tell. "Did Mrs. Gibbs overhear anything?" she asked, her tone as casual as if inquiring about the weather. Reed frowned, flipping a page. "She says it was a busy night. Heard raised voices around 8, likely Miss Henshaw and Pennington arguing about the book. Mr. Drayton was quieter, but Mrs. Gibbs thought he seemed agitated when he left. Miss Price was in the study most of the time, typing away, and Mr. Vane's visit was short, though he slammed the door on his way out. After that, she went to bed. Her room's at the back, so she didn't hear much." Miss Marple thanked him, her mind already weaving threads. The scarf, the scuff, the cigarette, the whiskey. Each was a piece of a puzzle, but the picture remained elusive. She glanced at Inspector Slack, who was now berating the sergeant over a smudged print. "Inspector," she called softly, "might I have a word with Mrs. Gibbs before I go? I shouldn't like to leave without offering my condolences." Slack waved a dismissive hand, clearly relieved to have her out of his way. "Go on then. She's in the kitchen, sniveling, but don't go stirring things up, Miss Marple." She inclined her head, her smile as meek as a vicar's wife, and made her way to the kitchen. Mrs. Gibbs, a stout woman with flour-dusted hands and red-rimmed eyes, was kneading dough with unnecessary vigor. "Oh, Miss Marple," she cried, wiping her hands on her apron. "It's awful, just awful. Mr. Pennington gone like that. Who'd do such a thing?" "There, there, Mrs. Gibbs," Miss Marple soothed, settling into a chair. "It's a terrible shock. But tell me, did anything strike you as odd last night? Visitors coming and going, perhaps?" Mrs. Gibbs sniffled, her hands trembling as she reached for a teapot. "It was all a bit queer, miss. Miss Henshaw was in a right state, shouting about the new book, said it wouldn't sell a copy. Mr. Drayton, he was all nerves, pacing like a cat. Miss Price kept to herself, but she looked worn out, poor lamb. And Mr. Vane, well, he was polite enough, but his eyes were hard, like he was holding something in." Miss Marple listened, her needles clicking softly in her lap, though she had not brought her knitting. The rhythm steadied her thoughts, each detail slotting into place. The scarf's scent, the window's scuff, the cigarette's ash, all pointed to a moment of violence, but the why and who eluded her. She thanked Mrs. Gibbs, promising to return with a jar of her rose-hip jelly, and stepped back into the crisp air. As she walked down the lane, the village unfolding in its quiet beauty, Miss Marple's mind churned. The study was a stage, its props carefully arranged by a killer who had not counted on her presence. Clara, Felix, Emily, Vane, each played a role, but only one had written the final act. She thought of her own village, where petty jealousies and hidden passions mirrored the grander dramas of Pennington's novels. Human nature, she knew, was the true scene of the crime, and she would unravel its secrets, one quiet observation at a time. Chapter 3. The Editor's Ambition. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of St. Mary Mead as Miss Jane Marple made her way to the modest tea-room where Clara Henshaw had agreed to meet. The village was settling back into its usual rhythm, but the air held a faint undercurrent of unease, like a melody played just off-key. Miss Marple's steps were measured, her black handbag tucked neatly under her arm, but her mind was anything but idle. Clara Henshaw, Lawrence Pennington's editor, was the first thread in the tangled skein of the novelist's death, and Miss Marple intended to tug gently to see what unraveled. The tea-room, with its chintz curtains and polished teapots, was a haven of village propriety. Clara sat at a corner table, her tailored navy suit as crisp as her reputation. Her auburn hair was swept into a severe bun, and her crimson lipstick, a shade not unlike the fatal scarf, stood out starkly against her pale complexion. She was leafing through a notebook, her pen tapping impatiently, when Miss Marple approached. "Miss Henshaw, how kind of you to spare a moment," Miss Marple said, her voice soft as a summer breeze. She settled into the chair opposite, her eyes taking in the editor's guarded posture. "Such a dreadful business about poor Mr. Pennington. I thought a quiet chat might ease the heart, don't you?" Clara's green eyes flicked up, assessing Miss Marple with the sharpness of a woman used to sizing up manuscripts and people. "Very kind, Miss Marple, but I'm rather pressed. The publishing world doesn't stop, even for tragedy." Her tone was brisk, but her fingers betrayed a slight tremor as they closed the notebook. "Of course," Miss Marple murmured, nodding to the waitress for a pot of tea. "You must have been terribly fond of Mr. Pennington's work. Such a brilliant man, though I hear he could be particular about his manuscripts." Clara's lips tightened, a faint crease appearing between her brows. Lawrence was a genius, but yes, particular is one way to put it. Obstinate, more like. His latest novel was a mess, overwrought, no structure. I told him it wouldn't do, not in today's market. He didn't take kindly to criticism. Miss Marple poured the tea, her movements deliberate, her eyes never leaving Clara's face. "An argument, then? I suppose that's not uncommon between an author and editor, but to lose such a talent." She let the sentence trail off, her expression one of gentle sorrow. Clara's fingers tightened around her teacup. "We argued, yes, last night at Willow Cottage. I went to discuss the final twist. He was set on publishing it as it was, but it would have flopped. I couldn't let that happen, not to his name or mine. I left him at 9, very much alive." Her voice was firm, but her gaze darted briefly to the window as if seeking escape. 9 o'clock, Miss Marple repeated, her tone as light as if confirming the time for a church fete. "And he was quite himself when you left? No other visitors lingering, perhaps?" She sipped her tea, her eyes bright behind the rim of the cup. Clara hesitated, then shook her head. "None that I saw. His assistant, Emily, was typing in the study when I arrived, but she stepped out to make tea. Lawrence was at his desk, scribbling notes, muttering about artistic integrity. I tried to reason with him, but he threatened to take his next book elsewhere. Can you imagine? After all I've done for him." Her voice rose, then caught, as if she'd said more than intended. Miss Marple's needles would have clicked had she brought her knitting, but her hands rested calmly in her lap. She thought of Clara's ambition, the kind that drove a woman to rise in a man's world, to polish a novelist's rough drafts into bestsellers. A threat to jump publishers would sting, perhaps enough to wound her pride, or her prospects. "A difficult position for you," Miss Marple said sympathetically. "To lose an author of his stature, it must have felt quite personal." Clara's eyes narrowed, but she recovered quickly, smoothing her expression. "It was professional, Miss Marple. I cared about his work, not his tantrums. I left him to his whiskey and his stubbornness. That was the last I saw of him." Miss Marple nodded, her mind noting the mention of whiskey, the same glass she'd seen barely touched on Pennington's desk. Clara's nails, she observed, were perfectly manicured, their polish a deep burgundy, not crimson, but the scarf's hue lingered in her thoughts. She recalled the cigarette in the ashtray, its faint red mark. Clara didn't smoke, so far as village gossip knew, but appearances, Miss Marple knew, could be as deceptive as a well-plotted novel. "And the scarf, Miss Henshaw?" Miss Marple asked, her tone so gentle it might have been a passing thought. "That lovely crimson one in the study. Did it catch your eye? So striking, wasn't it?" Clara's teacup paused halfway to her lips, a flicker of unease crossing her face. "I didn't notice any scarf. Lawrence's study was a clutter of papers and books. I was focused on our discussion, not his decor." Her voice was steady, but her fingers brushed the edge of her notebook, a nervous gesture. "Of course," Miss Marple said, smiling as if the matter were trivial. "Just a detail that struck me. Such a vibrant piece, not easily missed." She changed tack, her voice warm. "You must have known Mr. Pennington well, working so closely. Did he ever mention troubles? Rivals, perhaps, or admirers who overstepped?" Clara set her cup down, her posture stiffening. "Lawrence had his share of both. That fan, Felix Drayton, was forever sending letters, some quite intense. And Roland Vane. Well, you've heard of him, I'm sure. Another novelist, always in Lawrence's shadow. There was no love lost there. As for Emily Price, she was devoted, but I always thought she knew more than she let on. Quiet ones often do." Miss Marple tilted her head, as if considering a recipe rather than a murder. "How very observant of you. People do reveal themselves, don't they, in the smallest ways." She paused, letting the silence settle. "And you, Miss Henshaw, did you ever feel overlooked by Mr. Pennington? All that work, shaping his novels, yet his name alone on the cover." Clara's laugh was sharp, like glass breaking. "I'm an editor, Miss Marple. My job is to stay behind the scenes. I didn't need his gratitude, only his cooperation." But her eyes held a glint of something, resentment, perhaps, or a deeper wound. Miss Marple stored it away, like a skein of wool for later use. The tea-room clock chimed 3, and Clara glanced at her watch. "I really must go. Deadlines wait for no one, not even the dead." She gathered her notebook and rose, her movements brisk, but not without grace. "Thank you for the tea, Miss Marple. I hope the police sort this out quickly." "I'm sure they will," Miss Marple replied, her smile as soft as ever. "And thank you, Miss Henshaw, for indulging an old woman's curiosity." She watched Clara depart, her tailored figure cutting through the tea-room's cozy haze. The editor's poise was admirable, but Miss Marple had seen such poise before. In her niece's friend, who smiled through heartbreak, or the vicar's wife, who hid her temper behind a hymn book. Ambition, when thwarted, could turn as deadly as any blade. As she walked back to her cottage, the village basking in the golden afternoon light, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the study's details, the scarf's scent, the window's scuff, the cigarette's ash. Clara's timeline placed her at Willow Cottage until 9, but Mrs. Bantry's gossip suggested a later sighting near the lane. The discrepancy was small, but Miss Marple knew small things often hid great truths. She thought of Clara's polished nails, her controlled demeanor, and the scarf's vivid hue. Not hers, perhaps, but its presence nagged, like a dropped stitch in a pattern. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled by the fire, her knitting in hand at last. The needles clicked rhythmically, each stitch a step closer to clarity. Clara Henshaw had motive, professional pride, a career tied to Pennington's success. But motive alone was not enough. The scarf, the cigarette, the open window, they whispered of someone else's presence, someone who moved with purpose in the night. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, her mind as sharp as the needles in her hands. Clara was a thread, but the tapestry of Pennington's death was far from complete. Chapter 4. The Fan's Devotion. The late afternoon light filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage, casting delicate patterns on the polished floor. She sat in her armchair, her knitting needles pausing as she considered her next step. The death of Lawrence Pennington lingered in her thoughts, a puzzle with pieces that refused to align. Clara Henshaw's ambition had left a sharp impression, but Miss Marple knew better than to focus on a single thread. The village was abuzz with talk of Felix Drayton, the young man whose devotion to Pennington bordered on worship. His fervor intrigued her, for she had seen such passion turn to poison in the quiet corners of St. Mary Mead. She donned her hat and coat, her movements as precise as her thoughts, and set out for the village hall, where Felix was known to linger, distributing leaflets for a literary society he had founded in Pennington's honor. The hall was a modest building, its walls adorned with faded posters and notices for jumble sales. Inside, Felix stood at a table, sorting pamphlets with a nervous energy. He was a slight figure, barely past 20, with untidy, dark hair and eyes that darted like a startled deer's. His coat, hung carelessly on a chair, bore a faint smudge of ash on its sleeve, a detail Miss Marple noted with quiet interest. "Good afternoon, Mr. Drayton," she said, her voice as warm as a summer afternoon. "I hope I'm not interrupting. I've heard so much about your admiration for Mr. Pennington's work. Such a loss for you, I'm sure." Felix started, nearly dropping a stack of leaflets. "Oh, Miss Marple, yes, it's dreadful, just dreadful." His voice trembled, and he pushed his glasses up his nose, leaving a smudge of ink on his cheek. "Lawrence, Mr. Pennington, was a genius. His novels, they changed my life." Miss Marple settled onto a nearby bench, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "How wonderful to hear such enthusiasm. You must have known his work intimately. Did you visit him often at Willow Cottage?" Her tone was gentle, as if chatting about the weather, but her eyes missed nothing, the flush on Felix's cheeks, the way his fingers twitched. Well, yes, a few times," Felix admitted, his gaze flickering to the floor. "I wrote to him, you see, letters about his books, how they spoke to me. He was kind enough to reply once or twice, and last night I went to discuss a letter I'd sent. I left about 8:30. He was fine then, I swear." His voice rose, a note of panic creeping in. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of kindly concern. "Of course, dear, no one doubts your sincerity, but it must have been a thrill to meet him in person. Was he as you imagined? Sometimes our heroes disappoint us, don't they?" She tilted her head, her eyes soft but searching. Felix's hands stilled, clutching a pamphlet tightly. "He was brilliant. Gruff, maybe, but brilliant. We talked about the shadowed motive. His best, I think. I told him how it inspired me to write. He listened, but he seemed distracted, said he had work to do. I didn't stay long." His words tumbled out, as if eager to prove his innocence. Miss Marple's mind turned to the study, the crimson scarf, the cigarette, the open window. She recalled the ash on Felix's coat, so like the crumbling remains in Pennington's ashtray. "And did you notice anything unusual?" she asked, her voice as light as a breeze. "A scarf, perhaps, or a visitor lingering as you left." Felix shook his head, his glasses slipping again. "No, nothing like that. Just his papers, his typewriter. He was smoking his pipe, I think. No, wait, maybe not. I don't recall a pipe." He frowned, as if the memory eluded him. "I was too excited to notice much. I just wanted to talk to him, you know, to understand him." Miss Marple smiled, her thoughts drifting to young Tommy, the butcher's boy, who once followed the vicar about, hanging on his every sermon until a sharp word sent him sulking. Devotion, she knew, could curdle when unmet with equal warmth. "You must have felt so close to him," she said softly. "Almost like a friend. It's hard when someone we admire doesn't quite see us, isn't it?" Felix's face reddened, and he looked away, busying himself with the leaflets. He was busy, that's all. I didn't expect him to care about me. I just wanted to be near him, to learn from him. His voice cracked, and he cleared his throat, shoving his hands into his pockets. Miss Marple observed the gesture, noting the ink stains on his fingers, the faint tremble in his hands. She thought of the cigarette in the study, its red-tipped paper an anomaly in a room where Pennington's pipe was king. Felix smoked, she recalled. Mrs. Bantry had mentioned seeing him light a cigarette outside the post office, his hands shaking as he read one of Pennington's replies. Had his adoration turned to resentment, sparked by a dismissive word or a cold rebuff? "And when you left," she continued, her tone as mild as ever, "did you go straight home? Or perhaps you lingered, hoping for one last word?" Her question hung in the air, innocent yet pointed, like a needle poised to pierce. Felix's eyes widened, and he stammered, I went home. Straight home. It was dark, and I didn't want to bother him further. Why do you ask?" His voice held a defensive edge, and Miss Marple noted the sweat beading on his brow. "No reason, dear," she said, patting his arm as if soothing a child. "Just an old woman's curiosity. You've been most helpful." She rose, her movements slow but deliberate, and glanced at the coat on the chair. The ash smudge was faint, but unmistakable. "You'll take care of that coat, won't you? It's such a nice one, and ash can be so stubborn." Felix blinked, following her gaze, and his hand flew to the sleeve, brushing at it nervously. "Oh, that's nothing. Just from the fireplace at home. Thank you, Miss Marple." His smile was strained, and he turned back to his leaflets, his shoulders hunched. As she stepped out into the cooling evening, Miss Marple's mind was alive with details. Felix's devotion was palpable, but so was his agitation. The ash on his coat, the cigarette in the study. Small clues, but in St. Mary Mead, small clues often led to great truths. She thought of the postman's wife, who once adored a traveling preacher, until his indifference drove her to petty theft, a bid for attention. Felix's fervor could have flared into something darker, especially if Pennington had brushed him aside. The village was quiet now, its lamps glowing softly against the dusk. Miss Marple walked slowly, her thoughts weaving a pattern. The scarf's sandalwood scent, the window's scuff, the whiskey glass. Each piece hinted at a presence in the study after Felix's departure. Yet his nervous demeanor, his ash-stained coat, suggested he knew more than he let on. Was he a heartbroken fan, or a spurned disciple turned vengeful? Miss Marple's needles would have clicked had they been in her hands, each stitch tightening the fabric of suspicion around young Felix Drayton. Chapter 5. The Assistant's Loyalty. The evening air in St. Mary Mead carried a chill as Miss Jane Marple made her way along the winding lane to the modest cottage where Emily Price, Lawrence Pennington's assistant, resided. The village had settled into a hushed quiet, its lights twinkling like stars against the gathering dusk, but Miss Marple's mind was far from restful. Felix Drayton's nervous fervor had left her pondering the fine line between devotion and desperation. Yet another figure in this grim drama demanded her attention. Emily, the quiet shadow behind Pennington's brilliance, was a puzzle piece that might hold the key to the study's secrets. Emily's cottage was a small, ivy-clad affair, its garden neat but unassuming, much like the young woman herself. Miss Marple knocked gently, her black handbag a familiar weight under her arm. The door opened to reveal Emily, her pale face framed by mousy brown hair, her eyes red-rimmed from grief or sleeplessness. She wore a plain gray dress, its hem slightly frayed, and her hands clutched a damp handkerchief. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, come in. I wasn't expecting visitors." "I shan't stay long, my dear," Miss Marple replied, her tone as soothing as a lullaby. "I only thought you might need a kind word after such a dreadful day. Poor Mr. Pennington's loss must weigh heavily on you." She stepped inside, noting the sparse furnishings, a single armchair, a worn table, a shelf with a few books, their spines creased from use. Emily gestured to a chair, her movements hesitant. "It's kind of you to come. I still can't believe he's gone. He was so alive, always working, always thinking." Her voice broke, and she dabbed at her eyes, though no fresh tears fell. Miss Marple settled into the chair, her eyes taking in the room's simplicity. A typewriter sat on the table, its keys worn from hours of use, and a stack of typed pages bore corrections in a neat, precise hand. Emily's, no doubt. "You were his right hand, weren't you?" Miss Marple said, her smile warm. "Typing his manuscripts, keeping his world in order. It must have been quite a responsibility." Emily nodded, twisting the handkerchief. "I tried my best. Mr. Pennington was particular, but he trusted me. I typed his drafts, answered letters, kept his appointments. He said I made his work possible." A faint pride colored her words, but her shoulders slumped, as if the weight of that trust lingered still. Miss Marple's gaze softened, though her mind was as sharp as ever. She thought of the study, the crimson scarf, the cigarette's ash, the untouched whiskey. Emily had been there most of the evening, a constant presence in Pennington's orbit. "You were with him last night, I understand," she said gently. "Until 10, was it? It must have been a long day, with so many visitors." Emily's hands stilled, her eyes flickering with unease. "Yes, I was there until he sent me home. It was a busy night. Miss Henshaw, Mr. Drayton, Mr. Vane, all coming and going. I stayed in the study, typing, but Mr. Pennington was preoccupied. He seemed troubled, but he wouldn't say why." Her voice was steady, but her fingers resumed their nervous twisting. "Troubled?" Miss Marple tilted her head as if the word were a new stitch in her pattern. "How sad. Did he mention anything specific? A disagreement, perhaps, or something in his work?" Her tone was light, but her eyes caught the slight tightening of Emily's lips. "He didn't say much," Emily replied, her gaze dropping to the floor. "Just that the new book was important to him. The final twist. He kept parts of it locked away, even from Miss Henshaw. I typed what he gave me, but he was secretive about the rest. I left at 10, like I said. He was at his desk, alive and well." Her words were firm, almost rehearsed, and Miss Marple noted the faint flush on her cheeks. She thought of the locked drawer in Pennington's desk, mentioned by Constable Reed. Emily, as his assistant, likely had access to it, perhaps even a key. "A locked drawer, I hear," Miss Marple said, her voice as casual as if discussing a recipe. "Did he keep anything special there? A will, perhaps, or personal papers?" Her eyes were kind, but they missed nothing. The way Emily's hand tightened on the handkerchief, the quick glance toward the typewriter. "Oh, I wouldn't know," Emily said quickly. "He kept his private things private. I only handled the manuscripts he gave me. The drawer, I think it had his contracts, maybe his will. I never looked." Her voice wavered, and she smoothed her dress, a nervous gesture that reminded Miss Marple of the vicar's niece, who fidgeted when hiding a small lie. "Of course, dear," Miss Marple said, patting her hand. "You were loyal to him, weren't you? It's not easy, being so close to someone so brilliant. Sometimes loyalty asks more than we expect." Her words were gentle, but they carried a weight, and Emily's eyes met hers for a moment before darting away. "I did my job," Emily said softly. "He paid me fairly, and I owed him my best. He was good to me, even when he was moody. I'd never have hurt him." Her voice cracked, and she pressed the handkerchief to her lips, as if to stifle any further words. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts turning to the study's details. The scarf's sandalwood scent was absent here. Emily's cottage smelled faintly of lavender soap. The cigarette in the ashtray with its red-tipped paper was another matter. Emily didn't smoke, so far as Miss Marple knew, but the baker had mentioned her buying a late supper, suggesting she lingered near Willow Cottage past 10. And the locked drawer, had it held a promise of reward or a disappointment that festered? "Did you notice anything unusual last night?" Miss Marple asked, her tone as mild as ever. "A scarf, perhaps, or a sound as you left. The study window was open, I hear. Such a chilly night for it." Emily's eyes widened, and she shook her head. "I didn't notice a scarf. The window. I suppose it was open. Mr. Pennington liked fresh air when he worked late. I left through the front door, and I didn't hear anything odd. Just the usual village sounds, owls, the wind." Her words came quickly, and Miss Marple noted the faint tremor in her hands. She thought of her own maid, Lily, who once swore she'd left a party early, only to be spotted later by the milkman. Small discrepancies, Miss Marple knew, could unravel great secrets. "And you went straight home?" she asked, her smile encouraging. "It's a short walk, but the lanes can feel lonely at night." Yes, straight home," Emily said, her voice barely audible. "I was tired. It had been a long day." She stood as if to signal the visit's end, and busied herself with the teapot. "Would you like more tea, Miss Marple? I'm afraid I haven't much to offer." "No, thank you, dear," Miss Marple said, rising with a grace that belied her years. "You've been very kind to indulge me. I'll let you rest now." She paused at the door, her eyes lingering on the typewriter. "You must have typed such wonderful stories for him. It's a pity we shan't read his last one." Emily's lips parted, but no words came. She nodded, her expression a mix of grief and something deeper, guilt, perhaps, or fear. Miss Marple stepped into the evening, the air sharp against her cheeks. As she walked back to her cottage, her mind wove the threads of Emily's story. The assistant's loyalty was clear, but so was her poverty, the frayed dress, the sparse cottage. A will in that locked drawer might have promised security, or its absence might have sparked despair. The baker's tale of a late supper nagged at her, as did the open window. Had Emily truly left at 10, or had she lingered, her loyalty tested by some unseen slight? The village lamps glowed softly, casting shadows that danced like suspects in Miss Marple's mind. Emily Price was a quiet figure, but quiet figures, she knew, could harbor fierce passions. The scarf, the cigarette, the scuff mark, they pointed to a moment of violence, and Emily's presence in the study placed her close to it. Miss Marple's needles would have clicked had they been in her hands, each stitch drawing her closer to the truth hidden in the assistant's unassuming heart. Chapter 6. The Rival's Envy. The morning mist had burned away, leaving St. Mary Mead bathed in a crisp autumn light as Miss Jane Marple walked toward the village's edge, where Roland Vane, the rival novelist, kept a stylish cottage. The death of Lawrence Pennington hung over the village like a shadow, and Miss Marple's mind was a loom, weaving the threads of each suspect's story. Emily Price's quiet loyalty had left a delicate impression, but now her thoughts turned to Vane, whose literary rivalry with Pennington was the stuff of village legend. Envy, she knew from the petty feuds of St. Mary Mead, could fester into something far darker than words. Vane's cottage was a contrast to Emily's humble dwelling, a modern affair with sleek windows and a garden of sculpted shrubs, as if proclaiming its owner's flair. Miss Marple knocked, her gloved hand steady, her black handbag tucked under her arm. The door opened to reveal Roland Vane himself, a man in his late 30s, tall and lean, with dark hair swept back and a smile that was all charm but no warmth. His silk waistcoat and polished shoes spoke of success, but his eyes held a guarded edge, like a man who knew he was being watched. "Miss Marple, isn't it?" Vane said, his voice smooth as his prose. "The village's own sleuth. Come in, please. I suppose you're here about poor Lawrence." He gestured to a plush sitting room, where a fire crackled and bookshelves gleamed with his own novels, their titles bold in gold. "How kind of you to see me, Mr. Vane," Miss Marple said, her tone as gentle as a spring breeze. She settled into an armchair, her eyes taking in the room's elegance, the crystal decanter, the velvet curtains, a faint whiff of sandalwood cologne that stirred a memory. "Such a tragedy for Mr. Pennington. You knew him well, I understand, as a fellow writer." Vane's smile tightened, and he leaned against the mantel, his posture casual, but his fingers drumming lightly. "Knew him? In a manner of speaking. We moved in the same circles, competed for the same readers. Lawrence was formidable, I'll give him that. A pity he's gone." His words were polite, but his tone carried a bite, like a critic's barbed review. Miss Marple's hands rested in her lap, though her knitting needles would have clicked had they been present. She thought of the study, the crimson scarf, its sandalwood scent, the cigarette's ash, the scuffed windowsill. Vane's cologne matched that scent, a detail that pricked her curiosity. "You visited him last night, I hear," she said, her voice mild. "A literary matter, was it? It must be fascinating, your world of words." Vane's eyes narrowed slightly, but his smile held. "A brief visit, yes. Around 10:30. We were to discuss a joint event at the literary festival, readings, signings, that sort of thing. Lawrence wasn't keen, but I thought it might boost both our profiles. I was there 10 minutes, no more, left him at his desk, scribbling away." He shrugged, as if the matter were trivial, but his fingers stilled, betraying a flicker of tension. 10 minutes, Miss Marple repeated, her tone as if admiring a garden bloom. "And he was quite himself? No sign of distress?" Her eyes, bright behind her spectacles, caught the way Vane's jaw tightened, a fleeting crack in his polished facade. "He was his usual self, arrogant, dismissive," Vane said, a touch of venom seeping through. "Lawrence thought himself above the rest of us, you know. Always had to be the star. But he was alive when I left, if that's what you're getting at." His laugh was sharp, like a page torn from a book. Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to the village gossip. How Vane's latest novel had been eclipsed by Pennington's, its sales lackluster, while the shadowed motive topped the charts. She recalled Mrs. Bantry's tale of Vane's sharp words at a literary dinner, his envy barely veiled. "It must be trying," she said softly, "to share the stage with such a towering figure. I've seen it in our little village. how one person's success can cast a shadow on another. Vane's smile faded, and he crossed his arms, his cologne stronger now as he leaned forward. "If you're implying I was jealous, Miss Marple, you're mistaken. I've my own readers, my own work. Lawrence's shadow didn't bother me. I came to talk business, not to nurse grudges." His voice was firm, but his eyes flicked to the window, as if seeking an escape. "Of course," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. "But the smallest things can linger, can't they? Like that lovely scarf in the study, so striking, with a scent like your cologne. Did you notice it when you were there?" Her question was light, almost an afterthought, but her gaze was steady. Vane's hand paused mid-gesture, and for a moment his charm faltered. "A scarf? I didn't notice any scarf. Lawrence's study was a mess, papers everywhere, that infernal typewriter clacking. I was focused on our talk, not his clutter." His tone was dismissive, but his fingers brushed the edge of his waistcoat, a nervous tick Miss Marple noted. She thought of the study's details, the scarf's sandalwood scent, so like Vane's cologne, the open window with its scuff mark, the cigarette that didn't belong to Pennington. Vane's visit at 10:30 placed him close to the time of death, and the baker's wife had seen him pacing the lane near midnight, contradicting his claim of a swift departure. "And when you left," she said, her voice as gentle as ever, "you went straight home? The lanes can be so dark at that hour." Vane's eyes met hers, a flash of defiance in them. "Straight home, yes. I had no reason to linger. Lawrence and I said our piece, and I left. I'm not one for loitering in the cold." His smile returned, but it was strained, like a mask slipping. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt. "You've been most kind, Mr. Vane. I shan't take more of your time. It's such a pity about Mr. Pennington. His work was so admired. I suppose his new novel will be a loss to us all." She watched his face closely, noting the slight clench of his jaw at the mention of the novel. "A loss, yes," Vane said curtly. "But the world turns, and so does publishing. I've my own work to finish." He escorted her to the door, his charm restored but his eyes wary. As Miss Marple stepped into the bright morning, the village unfolding in its quiet beauty, her mind was alive with threads. Vane's envy was palpable, his cologne a damning link to the scarf. The scuff on the windowsill suggested a late entry or exit, and his midnight pacing hinted at more than a brief visit. She thought of Mr. Collins, the village grocer, whose envy of a rival's new shop led to a broken window one night. Envy, she knew, could drive a man to desperate acts, and Vane's polished exterior hid a heart that burned with it. Her steps were slow as she returned to her cottage, the air sharp with autumn's promise. The scarf, the cigarette, the whiskey glass, they formed a pattern, and Vane's presence in it was growing clearer. Yet Miss Marple knew better than to rush her stitches. Roland Vane was a thread, bold and vibrant, but the tapestry of Pennington's death held other colors still to be woven. Chapter 7. The Village Gossip. The sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, casting a golden glow across the village green as Miss Jane Marple sat in her garden, a cup of tea cooling beside her. The air was thick with the scent of late roses, but her thoughts were far from the tranquil scene. Roland Vane's sharp-edged charm and the faint trace of his cologne on the crimson scarf had tightened the threads of suspicion in her mind. Yet she knew the truth of Lawrence Pennington's death lay not only in the study's silent clues, but in the chatter that wove through the village like ivy. Gossip, Miss Marple had learned, was often the key to unlocking hidden truths, and St. Mary Mead was never short of it. She rose, her movements as deliberate as her thoughts, and made her way to the high street, where the village's pulse beat strongest. Her first stop was the post office, where Mrs. Clegg, a woman with a nose for news as keen as her knack for misdelivering letters, held court behind the counter. The bell above the door jingled as Miss Marple entered, her black handbag tucked neatly under her arm. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Clegg," Miss Marple said, her voice as warm as a vicarage hearth. "I thought I'd pop in for some stamps, and perhaps a word about poor Mr. Pennington, such a shock for us all." Mrs. Clegg's eyes lit up, her hands pausing over a stack of envelopes. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's dreadful, isn't it? Strangled in his own study. I said to Mr. Clegg, it's like one of his stories come to life, and all those visitors last night, quite the to-do at Willow Cottage." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I saw Miss Henshaw myself, you know, near the lane, past 9. She said she left at 9 sharp, but there she was, hurrying along like she'd seen a ghost." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly, her expression one of polite surprise. "Past 9, you say? How curious. I suppose she might have lingered to speak with someone." Her tone was light, but her mind filed away the discrepancy, recalling Clara Henshaw's firm claim of departing at 9. "Anyone else about that evening?" Mrs. Clegg nodded eagerly, her spectacles glinting. "Oh, yes, that young Mr. Drayton was by the gate at dusk, looking all fidgety. I was taking my evening walk, and there he was, pacing like he couldn't make up his mind to leave. And Miss Price, well, the baker's lad saw her buying a pie at 10:30, which is late for her. Said she looked proper upset, too. As for Mr. Vane, the milkman swears he saw him in the lane near midnight, though he told the police he was home by then." She shook her head, her voice rich with the thrill of scandal. "It's a queer business, Miss Marple." "Very queer indeed," Miss Marple murmured, selecting a few stamps with care. "Thank you, Mrs. Clegg. You've a sharp eye, as always." She smiled, her mind already weaving the new threads into the pattern. Clara's late departure, Felix's lingering, Emily's late supper, Vane's midnight pacing. Each was a stitch, small but vital, in the tapestry of the crime. Her next stop was the vicarage, where Mrs. Harmon, the vicar's wife, was pruning roses in the garden. A woman of boundless energy and a tongue that ran faster than the village clock, she was a treasure trove of unguarded observations. "Miss Marple," she called, waving a pair of secateurs. "Come to talk about the murder, I'll wager. Everyone's in a tizzy over it. Care for a cuppa?" "I shouldn't say no," Miss Marple replied, settling onto a garden bench. "It's a sad affair, isn't it? I was just thinking how busy Willow Cottage must have been last night, with all those comings and goings." Mrs. Harmon's eyes sparkled as she poured tea from a thermos. "Busy as a beehive. I heard from the grocer's wife that Miss Henshaw was shouting loud enough to wake the dead, pardon the phrase, when she left. Something about a book being unpublishable. And young Felix, bless him, was seen by the churchyard, scribbling in that notebook of his, looking like he'd lost his best friend. Emily Price, now, she's a quiet one. But the baker's wife said she was near tears buying that pie so late. And Mr. Vane, well, he's a charmer, but I saw him myself, stalking about the lane long after he said he'd gone home. It's all very suspicious, don't you think?" Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind as sharp as the secateur's. "Very suspicious," she agreed, her tone mild. Did anyone mention a scarf, perhaps? A crimson one, so striking in Mr. Pennington's study. Her question was casual, but her eyes watched Mrs. Harmon closely. A scarf? Mrs. Harmon frowned, her pruning forgotten. Can't say I heard about that, but I did hear Mrs. Gibbs say the study window was open, which is odd for such a chilly night. And that cigarette in the ashtray. Mr. Pennington never touched cigarettes, only his pipe. Makes you wonder who left it, doesn't it? Indeed it does, Miss Marple said, her smile gentle, but her thoughts racing. The cigarette, with its faint red mark, pointed away from Pennington and toward one of his visitors. The scarf, with its sandalwood scent, tugged her mind back to Roland Vane, but Clara's lipstick and Felix's ash-stained coat lingered in her thoughts. Emily's late supper suggested she, too, had not left when she claimed. The village's gossip was a chorus, each voice adding a note to the melody of suspicion. As she thanked Mrs. Harmon and made her way back to the high street, Miss Marple paused by the church, its spire cutting through the evening mist. She thought of the village's little dramas, how Miss Weatherby's jealousy over a rival's prize roses led to a snipped stem, or how young Tommy's infatuation with a shop girl ended in a broken window. Gossip, she knew, was like those roses, beautiful, tangled, and often hiding thorns. The discrepancies in the suspects' stories, Clara's late departure, Felix's pacing, Emily's pie, Vane's midnight walk, were thorns, pricking at the truth. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled by the fire, her knitting in hand at last. The needles clicked softly, each stitch a step toward clarity. The scarf was the key, she felt certain. Its owner had left it behind, perhaps in haste, perhaps deliberately. Its sandalwood scent pointed to Vane, but Clara's ambition, Felix's fervor, and Emily's quiet loyalty could not be dismissed. The village's chatter had given her a map, and now she must follow its paths to the heart of Pennington's death. Chapter 8. The Scarf's Secret. The morning in St. Mary Mead dawned with a clarity that belied the shadows of Lawrence Pennington's death. Miss Jane Marple sat at her breakfast table, the sunlight filtering through her lace curtains, her tea steaming gently beside a plate of uneaten toast. The village's gossip had woven a rich tapestry of clues, each thread, Clara's late departure, Felix's lingering, Emily's late supper, Vane's midnight pacing, adding depth to the mystery. Yet it was the crimson scarf, with its haunting sandalwood scent, that held her thoughts captive. Its presence in the study was no accident, she was certain, and its secret might unravel the killer's identity. She donned her coat and hat, her movements as precise as the stitches in her knitting, and set out for Willow Cottage. Constable Reed had agreed to let her visit the study once more, provided she touched nothing. "Inspector slacks off chasing leads," he'd said, his tone a mix of exasperation and trust. "But you've a way of seeing things, Miss Marple. Just don't tell him I let you in." The cottage was quiet, its roses drooping under the weight of dew. Mrs. Gibbs, the housekeeper, greeted her with a weary nod, her eyes still heavy with grief. "It's not right, Miss Marple," she murmured, leading her to the study. "Mr. Pennington gone, and all this poking about. I hope you find who did it." "I shall do my best," Miss Marple replied, her voice soft but resolute. The study was as she remembered, the mahogany desk cluttered with papers, the typewriter silent, the whiskey glass and cigarette ashtray untouched since the police's last sweep. The crimson scarf lay on a side table now, bagged as evidence but left for further inspection. Miss Marple approached it, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles. The scarf was exquisite, its silk shimmering in the morning light, its intricate weave suggesting a gift rather than a casual purchase. She leaned closer, careful not to disturb it, and inhaled. The sandalwood scent was unmistakable, laced with a hint of spice. Roland Vane's cologne, she was certain, though she kept her mind open to other possibilities. Clara Henshaw's elegance, Felix Drayton's fervor, Emily Price's quiet presence, each could have left such a trace, though none matched the scent so precisely. She noted a faint crease in the fabric, as if it had been tightly knotted, and a single, loose thread caught on the edge of the bag. Her gaze shifted to the window, its latch still undone, the scuff mark on the sill more pronounced in the daylight. It was not dirt, she realized, but a smear of wax, as if a shoe had brushed against a polished surface. The garden beyond was dense with ivy, a perfect screen for someone slipping in or out. She pictured the scene. Pennington at his desk, the killer entering silently, the scarf tightening in a moment of rage or calculation. But why leave it behind? A mistake or a deliberate misdirection? She turned to the desk, where the stack of the final twist pages lay undisturbed. The top sheet bore a faint ink smudge, as if handled hastily. The whiskey glass, its contents barely sipped, suggested a guest. Pennington's pipe was his vice, not liquor. The cigarette in the ashtray with its red-tipped paper was another anomaly. Miss Marple recalled Felix's ash-stained coat, but the red mark hinted at Clara's lipstick or a decorative brand. Emily, she knew, did not smoke, and Vane's cologne tied him to the scarf, not the cigarette. Each clue was a stitch, but the pattern remained elusive. "Constable Reed," she called softly, knowing he was hovering in the hall. "Might you tell me if the police found anything in the garden? Footprints, perhaps, or anything near the window?" Reed appeared, his notebook at the ready. "Not much, miss. The ground's too tangled with ivy for clear prints, but they found a broken twig just outside, like someone stepped on it. And a bit of ash, like from a cigarette, caught in the leaves. Could have been from earlier, though. Mr. Pennington's visitors often smoked in the garden." Miss Marple nodded, her mind noting the ash. "And the scarf. Has anyone claimed it? It's such a distinctive piece." "No, miss," Reed said, scratching his head. "Mrs. Gibbs says it wasn't Mr. Pennington's. None of the visitors mentioned it either. Inspector Slack thinks the killer left it, but he's not sure why. Maybe they panicked." "Perhaps," Miss Marple murmured, her eyes returning to the scarf. She thought of her neighbor, Mrs. Finch, who once left a glove at a tea party, not out of carelessness, but to mark her place in a petty feud. The scarf felt deliberate, its scent a signature. Vane's cologne was the strongest link, but Clara's ambition, Felix's obsession, and Emily's access to the study could not be dismissed. She thanked Reed and stepped into the garden, her shoes crunching on the gravel. The ivy was thick, but a narrow path led to the window, its edges worn by frequent use. She crouched, her knees protesting, and spotted a faint indentation in the soil. Not a footprint, but a mark where something heavy had rested, perhaps a knee or a hand. The broken twig lay nearby, its fracture fresh. Someone had been here, she was certain, and not just to admire the roses. As she walked back to her cottage, the village stirring with its daily rhythm, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the suspects. Clara's late departure, caught by Mrs. Cleong-Haw, suggested she had lingered beyond her stated time. Felix's pacing at dusk, seen by the postmistress, hinted at reluctance to leave. Emily's late supper, noted by the baker's lad, placed her near Willow Cottage past 10. And Vane's midnight walk, reported by the milkman, contradicted his claim of a swift exit. The scarf tied them together, its scent pointing to Vane, but its presence a question mark. She settled by her fire, her knitting in hand, the needles clicking like a metronome to her thoughts. The scarf was no mere trinket. It was a clue, left in haste or cunning. Its sandalwood scent was Vane's, but Miss Marple knew better than to trust a single thread. In St. Mary Mead, she had seen a scarf left behind to deflect blame, much like Mrs. Potter's shawl, dropped to mislead a jealous rival. The killer had entered through the window, she suspected, leaving the scarf as a marker. Or a mistake. Her needles moved faster, each stitch drawing her closer to the truth hidden in the study's silent embrace. Chapter 9. The Hidden Manuscript. The soft glow of morning light filtered through the vicarage windows, where Miss Jane Marple sat with a cup of tea, courteously provided by Mrs. Harmon. The village of St. Mary Mead hummed with its usual rhythm, but the shadow of Lawrence Pennington's death lingered, a discordant note in the village's quiet melody. The crimson scarf, with its telltale sandalwood scent, had tightened Miss Marple's suspicions around Roland Vane. Yet the puzzle of the study, the cigarette's ash, the scuffed windowsill, the untouched whiskey, demanded more threads to complete the pattern. A chance remark from Mrs. Harmon about Pennington's secretive new novel had sparked Miss Marple's curiosity, and she resolved to pursue this lead with her usual gentle tenacity. Mrs. Harmon bustled about, her pruning shears replaced by a tray of scones. "You're sleuthing again, aren't you, Miss Marple?" she said, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "I knew you wouldn't let poor Mr. Pennington's murder rest. Have you spoken to Emily Price yet? She was in and out of that study like a shadow, typing his secrets. I heard from the grocer's wife that he kept a new manuscript locked away, one even his editor didn't see." Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile, her hands folded neatly in her lap, though her mind was as active as her knitting needles would have been. "A locked manuscript, you say? How intriguing. I suppose Emily might know something about it, being so close to Mr. Pennington's work." Her tone was mild, but her eyes sharpened, recalling Emily's nervous demeanor and the locked drawer in the study. "Oh, Emily's a mouse, but she sees everything," Mrs. Harmon said, slathering jam on a scone. "The vicar heard her mention a story that Mr. Pennington was terribly secretive about. Said it was his masterpiece, but he wouldn't let anyone read the whole thing, not even Miss Henshaw. Makes you wonder what was in it, doesn't it?" "Indeed it does," Miss Marple murmured, her thoughts drifting to the study's cluttered desk, the stack of pages marked "The Final Twist." A hidden manuscript suggested a motive beyond professional pride or personal slight, perhaps a secret that threatened someone's reputation. She thanked Mrs. Harmon and made her way to Emily's cottage, her steps slow but purposeful, her black handbag a familiar companion. Emily was at her typewriter when Miss Marple knocked, her face pale and her eyes shadowed with fatigue. "Miss Marple," she said, rising quickly, "I wasn't expecting you again. Is there news about Mr. Pennington?" Her voice trembled, and her hands clutched the edge of the table as if bracing for a blow. "No news, my dear," Miss Marple said, her tone as soothing as a lullaby. "I only thought you might like to talk about Mr. Pennington's work. You were so devoted to it. I hear he was writing something quite special. A new novel, perhaps? She settled into a chair, her eyes noting the typed pages on the table, their margins filled with careful corrections. Emily's gaze flickered to the typewriter, then back to Miss Marple. "He was working on the final twist," she said softly. "It was different from his others, darker, more personal. He kept parts of it in that locked drawer, even from Miss Henshaw. I typed what he gave me, but he said the rest wasn't ready." Her fingers twisted a stray thread on her sleeve, a gesture Miss Marple noted with quiet interest. "How fascinating," Miss Marple said, her voice light. "Did he ever mention what made it so special? A particular character, perhaps, or a theme?" Her eyes were gentle, but they caught the flush that crept into Emily's cheeks. He said it was inspired by real people," Emily admitted, her voice barely audible. "He didn't name them, but there was a passage, a cruel one, about a writer who'd lost his spark. I typed it myself and it felt pointed. I think it was about Mr. Vane." Her eyes widened, as if she'd said too much, and she busied herself with the teapot. Miss Marple's mind quickened, the threads tightening. A manuscript mocking Roland Vane would sting his pride, perhaps enough to drive him to violence. She recalled the sandalwood scent of the scarf, so like Vane's cologne, and the scuff on the windowsill, suggesting a clandestine entry. "How troubling for Mr. Vane," she said softly. "Did he know about this passage, do you think?" Emily shook her head, her hands trembling. "I don't know. Mr. Pennington was careful, but Mr. Vane visited that night. If he saw the manuscript—" Her voice trailed off, and she looked away, her expression a mix of guilt and fear. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts turning to the study's clues, the cigarette, the whiskey, the open window. A manuscript that ridiculed Vane could be the spark that ignited his envy into murder. "You've been most helpful, Emily," she said, rising. "I wonder, might the police have found that manuscript? It could be important." Emily's eyes darted to the door. I don't know. The drawer was locked when I left. I didn't see it after." Her words came quickly, and Miss Marple noted the nervous edge, like the village seamstress who once hid a stolen brooch. She thanked Emily and made her way to Willow Cottage, where Constable Reed was overseeing a final sweep of the study. "Miss Marple," he greeted, his tone weary but respectful. "Back again? The inspector's got us combing every inch, but that manuscript's gone missing. The locked drawer was empty when we checked." "Empty?" Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted, her mind racing. "How curious. Might I ask if you've searched elsewhere? Mr. Vane's cottage, perhaps?" Her tone was mild, but her eyes were sharp, fixed on Reed's reaction. "We're getting to it," Reed said, flipping his notebook. "Vane's place is next. If that manuscript's there, we'll find it." He hesitated, then added, "We did find something odd in his garden, a burned scrap of paper, typed, with a few words left. Something about a fading scribe. Sounded like Pennington's style." Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. "A fading scribe," she repeated, her voice soft. "How very like Mr. Pennington to be so vivid. Thank you, Constable." She left the cottage, her mind weaving the new clue into the pattern. A burned manuscript fragment, mocking a rival writer, pointed directly to Vane. Had he seen it during his visit, his pride wounded beyond repair? The scarf's scent, the window's scuff, the midnight pacing, all aligned with his presence. As she walked back to her cottage, the village bathed in the soft light of noon, Miss Marple thought of Mrs. Carter, who once burned a rival's recipe book in a fit of jealousy. Envy, she knew, could drive a man to destroy evidence, and lives. The manuscript's absence was no accident, and Vane's cologne on the scarf was a thread she could no longer ignore. Her needles would have clicked had they been in her hands, each stitch pulling the truth closer to the surface. Chapter 10. The Confrontation. The late afternoon sun cast a mellow glow over St. Mary Mead, gilding the rooftops and softening the edges of the village's quiet lanes. Miss Jane Marple sat in her parlor, her knitting untouched on the table, her mind a whirl of threads drawn tight by the morning's discoveries. The burned manuscript fragment, with its cruel jab at a fading scribe, had pointed a sharp finger at Roland Vane, and the crimson scarf's sandalwood scent seemed to cling to him like a shadow. Yet Miss Marple knew the truth required more than suspicion. It demanded a moment of clarity, where the suspect's stories could be tested against the study's silent clues. She resolved to gather them at Willow Cottage, where the scene of Lawrence Pennington's death might loosen the tongue of the guilty. She sent notes to Clara Henshaw, Felix Drayton, Emily Price, and Roland Vane, requesting their presence that evening for a discussion with Constable Reed. Her tone was polite, almost apologetic, but her intent was as precise as her knitting stitches. Inspector Slack, informed of her plan, grumbled but allowed it, his faith in her instincts grudgingly outweighing his irritation. "Just don't turn it into a circus, Miss Marple," he'd muttered, his mustache twitching. By 7 o'clock, the study at Willow Cottage was crowded, its air heavy with tension. Clara stood by the desk, her tailored suit impeccable, her eyes wary. Felix hovered near the bookshelves, his hands fidgeting with a dog-eared pamphlet. Emily sat quietly, her gray dress blending into the shadows, her face pale. Vane lounged by the window, his charm a polished veneer, though his fingers drummed against the sill. Constable Reed stood at the door, his notebook ready, while Miss Marple took the armchair, her small figure commanding the room with quiet authority. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice as gentle as a vicarage tea party. "I know this is distressing, but Mr. Pennington's death demands clarity. The study, you see, tells a story, and I believe one of you can help us read its final page." Her eyes moved from face to face, noting Clara's tight lips, Felix's nervous glance, Emily's clasped hands, Vane's forced smile. She gestured to the desk, where the whiskey glass and cigarette ashtray remained. "Last night, Mr. Pennington had visitors, you four. Each of you left him alive, or so you say, yet he was found strangled with this scarf." She nodded to the crimson silk, now on display in its evidence bag. Its scent, sandalwood and spice, caught my attention. And then there's the manuscript, the final twist, parts of which were burned, perhaps to hide a truth. Clara's eyes narrowed. "What are you implying, Miss Marple? I argued with Lawrence about his book, yes, but I left at 9. I had no reason to harm him." Her voice was sharp, but her fingers brushed her notebook, a nervous tick. Felix shifted, his glasses slipping. "I was here earlier, at 6. I just wanted to talk about his work. I didn't see any scarf or manuscript." His voice cracked, and he glanced at the ashtray, his face flushing. Emily's voice was barely audible. "I typed for him until 10, then went home. I didn't know about any burned pages." Her eyes darted to the locked drawer, then away, her hands trembling. Vane's laugh was brittle. "This is absurd. I was here for 10 minutes discussing a literary event. I left him scribbling, alive. You're chasing ghosts, Miss Marple." His eyes met hers, defiant, but his hand grazed the window's scuff mark. Miss Marple's smile was serene, but her gaze was steel. "The village, you see, has eyes. Miss Henshaw, you were seen near the lane past 9, despite your claim. Mr. Drayton, you lingered by the gate at dusk. Miss Price, a late supper at 10:30 suggests you stayed nearby. And Mr. Vane, you were spotted pacing the lane near midnight." She paused, letting the words settle. "But the scarf tells the most. Its scent matches your cologne, Mr. Vane, and the burned manuscript fragment, a fading scribe, points to a wound to your pride." Vane's face paled, his charm cracking. "That's nonsense. I don't wear scarves and I burned nothing. You've no proof." His voice rose, but his eyes flicked to the scarf, betraying a flicker of fear. Miss Marple continued, her tone soft but relentless. "The window's scuff mark. Mr. Vane suggests someone entered or left after your visit. The cigarette's ash matches that on Mr. Drayton's coat, but Mr. Pennington didn't smoke cigarettes. Miss Henshaw's lipstick is crimson, yet the scarf's scent isn't hers. Miss Price had access to the locked drawer, but the manuscript's absence points elsewhere. I believe you returned, Mr. Vane, through the window, after reading a manuscript that mocked you. In a rage, you used your scarf to silence him." The room was still, the air thick with accusation. Clara's hand froze on her notebook. Felix's breath hitched. Emily's eyes widened. Vane's smile vanished, his hands clenching. "You're spinning tales, old woman," he spat, but his voice shook. "I left him alive. You can't prove otherwise." Miss Marple's eyes held his, calm but unyielding. "The village sees, Mr. Vane. The burned pages in your garden, the scent on the scarf, your late-night walk. They speak louder than your words. Envy is a cruel master, isn't it?" Her voice was almost pitying, and Vane's defiance wavered. Constable Reed stepped forward, his notebook snapping shut. "We'll need to search your cottage again, Mr. Vane. Those burned pages are evidence enough for now." Vane's shoulders slumped, his charm a faded mask, as the weight of Miss Marple's words settled over him. She rose, her small figure dwarfed by the room, but towering in its silence. "Thank you all," she said gently. "I hope we've brought some peace to Mr. Pennington." As she left the study, the village's lamps glowed softly, and her mind was already turning to the final unraveling of the truth. Chapter 11. The Confession. The evening air in St. Mary Mead was thick with the scent of wood smoke as Miss Jane Marple lingered outside Willow Cottage, her small figure silhouetted against the fading light. The confrontation in the study had left a palpable tension, like a tightly wound thread ready to snap. Roland Vane's defiance had cracked under her steady gaze, his polished charm no match for the weight of the clues, the crimson scarf's sandalwood scent, the burned manuscript fragment, the scuff on the windowsill. Yet Miss Marple knew that suspicion alone was not enough. The truth required a confession, a moment when the killer's own words would complete the tapestry of Lawrence Pennington's death. Inside the cottage, Constable Reed had detained Vane, his notebook open as he prepared to escort him to the station for further questioning. Clara Henshaw, Felix Drayton, and Emily Price had been allowed to leave, their faces a mix of relief and unease as they slipped into the night. Miss Marple, however, remained, her presence as unobtrusive as a shadow, but as compelling as the village clock's steady chime. She stepped back into the study, where Vane stood by the desk, his hands cuffed, his eyes darting like a cornered animal's. "Mr. Vane," she said softly, her voice carrying the gentle authority of a school mistress addressing a wayward pupil. "I wonder if you might help us understand. The scarf, the manuscript, the window, they tell a story, but only you can give it its ending." Her eyes, bright behind her spectacles, held his, calm but unrelenting. Vane's jaw tightened, his earlier bravado crumbling like ash. "You're wrong," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. "I told you. I left him alive. I had no reason to kill him." His gaze flicked to the crimson scarf, still in its evidence bag, its vibrant hue a silent accusation. Miss Marple settled into the armchair, her hands folded in her lap, though her knitting needles would have clicked had they been present. "Envy is a heavy burden, Mr. Vane," she said, her tone almost sorrowful. "I've seen it in our little village, how a neighbor's success can fester in the heart. Your novels are fine, but Mr. Pennington's shone brighter, didn't they? And that manuscript, the final twist, with its mocking portrait of a fading scribe, it must have cut deeply." Vane's face twitched, a flash of anger breaking through his mask. "You don't know what it's like," he spat, his voice low and raw. "To pour your soul into words, only to have his books on every shelf, his name on every tongue. He was insufferable, lording it over me, over all of us. But I didn't kill him." His hands strained against the cuffs, his eyes wild. Miss Marple's gaze remained steady, her voice soft but piercing. "You visited at 10:30, you said, for a literary event. But you saw the manuscript, didn't you? On his desk, perhaps. Left carelessly open. You read that passage, and it burned like a brand. You returned later, through the window, with that scarf. Your scarf, a gift from a fan, scented with your cologne. In a moment of rage, you silenced him." She paused, letting the words settle like dust in the quiet room. Vane's shoulders slumped, his defiance draining away. He sank onto a chair, his head bowed, the firelight casting shadows across his face. "It wasn't planned," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I went to talk, yes, about the festival, but I saw the pages, the final twist, that passage. It was me, mocked as a failure, a has-been. He was going to publish it, ruin me." His voice broke, and he buried his face in his hands. Constable Reed stepped closer, his pencil poised, but Miss Marple raised a hand, urging patience. "Go on, Mr. Vane," she said gently. "Tell us what happened." Vane's breath hitched, his words spilling like ink from a broken pen. "I left at 10, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. I walked the lanes, trying to calm down, but the words kept burning. I came back, climbed through the window. He didn't hear me, he was typing. I confronted him, showed him the page. He laughed, said it was just fiction, but I knew it was personal. The scarf was in my pocket, a gift from a reader, one I never wore. I don't know why I did it. I grabbed it, wrapped it around his neck. It was over so fast." His voice choked, and he looked up, his eyes haunted. "I didn't mean to kill him. I just wanted him to stop." Miss Marple nodded, her heart heavy but her mind clear. "And the manuscript? You took it, burned it in your garden to hide the truth?" Vane nodded, his voice a whisper. "I took the pages from the drawer, burned them. I thought it would end there. But the scarf, I panicked, left it behind. I didn't think about the scent." He laughed bitterly, a sound like breaking glass. "He would have ruined me, Miss Marple, my career, my name. Gone." She rose, her small figure commanding the room's silence. "Envy is a cruel master, Mr. Vane. she said softly. "It twists the heart, makes monsters of us all. You might have faced him with words, not violence." Her tone held no judgment, only a quiet sadness, like a grandmother mourning a child's misstep. Constable Reed cleared his throat, his voice firm but respectful. "That's enough for now, Mr. Vane. We'll take your statement at the station." He guided Vane toward the door, casting a grateful glance at Miss Marple. "You've a knack, miss. The inspector'll have to eat his hat." Miss Marple smiled faintly, stepping into the cool night air. The village was still, its lamps glowing like beacons in the dark. She thought of Mrs. Langley, who once destroyed a rival's prize quilt in a fit of envy, only to weep at its loss. Vane's confession was the final stitch, completing the pattern of Pennington's death. The scarf, the burned pages, the midnight walk, they had all pointed to a heart consumed by rivalry. As she walked home, her steps slow but steady, Miss Marple felt the weight of truth settled, though it brought no joy. Chapter 12. The Quiet Resolution. The dawn broke over St. Mary Mead with a gentle hush, the village stirring softly under a sky streaked with pink and gold. Miss Jane Marple sat by her parlor window, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically, each stitch a counterpoint to the calm that had settled after Roland Vane's confession. The weight of Lawrence Pennington's death had lifted, yet the air held a lingering melancholy, like the fading notes of a village hymn. The crimson scarf, the burned manuscript, the scuffed windowsill. These clues had woven a tapestry of envy and rage, now complete with Vane's admission of guilt. But for Miss Marple, the resolution brought no triumph, only a quiet reflection on the frailties of the human heart. She sipped her tea, her eyes tracing the familiar outlines of her garden, where the roses bowed under the morning dew. The village was returning to its routine. Children scampered to school, the milkman's cart rattled along the lane, and the church bell chimed its steady call. Yet whispers of the scandal at Willow Cottage lingered, passed from the post office to the baker's shop, each retelling adding a flourish to the tale of Vane's downfall. Miss Marple, however, preferred the truth's simplicity, unadorned by gossip's embellishments. Her thoughts drifted to the study, where the scarf's sandalwood scent had first pointed to Vane. She recalled Clara Henshaw's sharp ambition, Felix Drayton's fervent adoration, and Emily Price's quiet loyalty, each a thread in the pattern, but none as taut as Vane's envy. The burned manuscript fragment, with its cruel mockery of a fading scribe, had been the spark, igniting a rivalry that ended in murder. She thought of Mrs. Tuttle, the village seamstress, whose envy of a rival's finer stitches led to a slashed dress, a petty act that mirrored Vane's greater crime. Human nature, Miss Marple mused, was the same in grand tragedies as in small slights. A knock at the door broke her reverie. Mrs. Bantry bustled in, her scarves fluttering, her face alight with excitement. "Jane, you've done it again," she exclaimed, settling into a chair without invitation. "The whole village is talking about Vane's confession, strangling poor Mr. Pennington with his own scarf. How dreadful! And you saw it all, didn't you? The scarf, the burned pages, everything 8 inches. Miss Marple smiled, her needles pausing. "I saw only what was there, Dolly. The study told its story, and the village helped me read it. People reveal themselves, you know, in the smallest ways." Her tone was mild, but her eyes held a glint of satisfaction, like a gardener admiring a well-tended bed. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her voice dropping. "But how did you know it was Vane? Clara was so sharp, Felix so odd, and Emily, well, she was always there, wasn't she? I'd have thought any of them could have done it. Miss Marple's smile deepened, her fingers resuming their rhythm. They all had motives, Dolly, but motives are like roses, beautiful, but not always the root. The scarf's scent was Vane's, and the burned manuscript pointed to his pride. The window's scuff mark showed a second visit, and the village saw him pacing long after he claimed to leave. It was a pattern, you see, and he was the thread that tied it together. Mrs. Bantry shook her head, marveling. "You're a wonder, Jane. Inspector Slack's fuming, of course. He hates being outdone by a meddling spinster, as he calls you. But he's got Vane in custody, and they found more burned pages in his garden. It's all sewn up, thanks to you." Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her expression softening. "I only wish it hadn't come to such an end. Envy is a cruel thing, Dolly. It twists the heart, makes us forget our better selves. Mr. Vane might have written his own story, but he chose to end another's instead." Her voice held a quiet sadness, like a prayer for a lost soul. As Mrs. Bantry chattered on, Miss Marple's thoughts wandered to the other suspects. Clara, freed from suspicion, would sharpen her ambition elsewhere. Felix, his devotion shattered, might find a new idol or fade into his pamphlets. Emily, loyal to the end, would carry her grief quietly, her modest life unchanged. The village would move on, its scandals fading like autumn leaves, but Miss Marple's sharp eyes would remain watchful, knowing human nature's shadows never truly vanished. She rose to see Mrs. Bantry out, the morning light brightening her parlor. As she returned to her chair, her tea now cold, she picked up her knitting, the needles clicking once more. The case was closed, the truth laid bare. But St. Mary Mead held countless stories, each waiting for a moment to unravel. With a sigh, she sipped her tea, her mind already alert for the next thread that might catch her eye.